Hello and a warm welcome, everyone. Today we have with us a very important guest, and his name is Peter Heehs. Let me first introduce about him. He is an independent scholar based in Pondicherry, India, and he is connected with the Sri Aurobindo Ashram archives and on the editorial board of the collected works of Sri Aurobindo project. He has also published more than 70 articles in journals such as History and Theory, Modern Asian Studies, and Postcolonial Studies, and also in magazines such as History Today and Art India. He is the author and editor of 13 books, the most recent one of which are The Lives of Sri Aurobindo, that is published from Columbia University Press in 2008. Again, the other book, Writing the Self, Diaries, Memoirs, and the History of the Self from Bloomsbury Academic, that also named as Outstanding Academic Title for 2013 by choice, and The Mother, A Life of Sri Aurobindo's Spiritual Collaborator, that was again published in 2025. So I welcome you, Peter Heehs.
Thank you.
Now, before delving into the discussion, let me ask you about if I may, that what inspired you to delve into this Sri Aurobindo? What inspired you?
Developed gradually. I read his books before he came to India and was quite interested in him. So when I came to India, I went directly to Pondicherry. And it just so happened that a gentleman who was going to start an archives at the ashram and needed people to help him. So he asked me if I'd like to participate, and I said, fine. And gradually more people joined. We finished up the former collected works of Sri Aurobindo, and then as new material came in, we published a small journal, and then it became evident that we had to start work on a new complete works, and that took quite a long time. My original interest just found a way that it could express itself in Pondicherry, and I've been doing that ever since. You've lost your voice, Tanima.
Yeah. So interesting. First, it was really kind of, let me share one snippet of my meeting with you. I was really inspired because I was working on Sri Aurobindo, and the seminar we met. It was really enchanting for me that I have quoted your works in my paper, and to meet you in person, I was really excited and looking forward to. So yeah, it was a lovely memory which I'll have, and definitely in future we'll meet again.
I
And
was
that was
glad to
an
meet
interesting,
you there also.
definitely, yeah. So to move on, in you have written the lives of Sri Aurobindo, and you have presented his Aurobindo as many lives. So is this approach necessary or it's limiting?
Certainly not necessary. You have to limit any book that you're going to work on. You have to set limits. And this was one way for me to structure the book, to state how I was going to approach the subject. But it's certainly not the only way that it could be done. In fact, dozens of other books have been done in different ways.
Okay. So can you talk about that? Can history fully capture the spiritual figure? Is it possible?
I don't think history can fully capture anybody. Of course, with a rich even more difficult than if it's a person whose life was just uh, lived in the outer world, in outer activities. Um, so no, I mean, there's no possibility of fully capturing um, anyone whatsoever. I mean, if someone was to write a biography of you and do it in a historical way, they'd miss quite a bit, obviously. So you just have to decide how you're going to go about your inquiry and your expression, and then let things take their own form.
Okay. So, where do you draw the line between myth or devotion and history? Where do you draw the line?
The paper, I don't know if you've seen it, in history theory called Myth, History, and Theory. And I begin with a kind of technical definition of the words mythos, which is the Greek word for truth as authoritative uh, declaration. It doesn't just mean myths about the gods or things like that. It's a form of expression, and it's generally opposed to logos, which is myth as demonstrable truth, demonstrated truth. So these two things are often considered sort of uh, oppositional, and it's a good habit to not mix up your myth with your history, and not mix up history when you're doing myth. Um, you mentioned devotion. That's just a personal attitude. You can be a devotional myth maker, and you can be a devotional historian. It depends on you. The two, uh, that wouldn't rule out any approach. It's just a manner that you, as an individual, might want to approach the subject.
Yeah,
I
that's
can
right.
go on a little bit
Yeah,
more
please,
about that,
please.
but it might become a little bit technical. Now, history, I'll go quickly, is a form of logos presentation. History, the word historia in Greek, and this is where the what you call the Western mode of history comes from. Uh, the word means inquiry. And the early Greek historians were people who inquired in what happened. And they did it by going to uh, reliable sources. So if you're writing about the Peloponnesian War, then you go and you speak to people who participated in that war, you visit the sites and that sort of thing. So that's a historia approach. And that's what gave birth in the West to history. Now,
Okay.
in India, we'll get maybe I'm anticipating, but in India, there was no strong historia approach to the past. Um, what is has developed in India is Itihas Puran, and that's another mode of presentation. And since it's based on what I call authoritative statements, authoritative declarations, it can't really be called an inquiry into something that you want to find documented facts about, that sort of thing. When you read Itihas, when you read the Ramayana, then there's a certain amount of knowledge that you can gain about what Valmiki wrote about um, the life of Ram, and the whole story of Sita being carried off to Lanka and everything like that. So that is Itihas Puran. It's a perfectly legitimate mode of an inquiry, but it can't be called history in the sense of disciplined inquiry based on documentary materials. Of course, the Ramayana is itself a document, but the question is, does the Ramayana necessarily correlate to things that happened in the past? So, for instance, in the Ramayana, you have the story of the Vana Seva building the Ram Setu, and so in that way, allowing Ram to walk over to Lanka. That's you can read about that in the Ramayana, and it tells clearly the story of how Valmiki wanted you to approach the understanding of what happened. The question is that so that's a statement. If you want to study how it was presented, then you read the Ramayana, and you can understand the whole story of I don't know the story myself very well, but Sugriva got all the monkeys together, and then they worked and they built. So that is knowledge that is contained in the Ramayana, and it's known to people in India and elsewhere through the authoritative text, namely the Ramayana. It's not a historical statement in the sense of historia in West, what you call mode of history. Um, Historia would want to have, in order to be historia, in order to be history in that sense, you would need to have documented material. You would need to go beyond just the text of the Ramayana itself and find supporting documents, archaeological documents, and that sort of thing. And that is not something that the simple reading of the Ramayana is going to give you. Now, so the Ramayana is fine in its own way. It's a very important text in the Indian tradition, and people should know it and study it as a text in the Indian tradition. But when, say, you want to make a quasi-historical statement that the islands that are there in the Palk Strait linking India and Sri Lanka were actual with the very same stones that were placed there by the Vanarasena is not something that you can support. So when you try to mix up the two things and say that this very stone was placed there by Sugriva at a certain point, it's not something that can be documented. So it's not a historical statement, it's a Itihas Puran statement, which is perfectly fine. But there's a difference between Itihas Puran and history, historia, in the sense I was talking about.
But do you find, because the survey nowadays, as you mentioned, like the it cannot be termed as historical, but it's um, what basically then is the difference between itihas and the history in
Well,
Indian
that's what I was trying
context
to
when we
say.
talk?
That
Yeah.
Itihas is basically in India the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, and texts like that. Of course, in modern India, Itihas is used to mean history in the Western sense. That I think is a bit of a mix-up. Itihas Purana is the study of texts like the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, learning all the stories in it. You must know people who are very familiar with all the characters in the Ramayana or the Mahabharata and can tell the stories and understand correctly what those stories are meant to say. So that's an Itihas Puran approach to things. History really has nothing to say. There's no documents that outside of the Sanskrit texts themselves and the later translations that tell you what happened, whether that was a historical event, whether the Vanaraseva actually built that I believe it was a floating bridge, floating rock bridge. So that's not something that either can be approached historically or scientifically. It's just a different mode of study, and it's a study that should, in fact, be made, but it shouldn't be supposed to be a historical study. It's an Itihas Puran study.
Okay. So then, what actually? How you are talking about Ramayana and Mahabharata, but can mythology be a form of history? Uh, can you talk about it?
What do you mean by form of history? Obviously,
Mhm. Yeah.
the Ramayana and the Mahabharata are texts, ancient texts that exist. They were written down at a certain time, and they've been passed down to us, and they also exist in oral tradition. And in fact, of course, there's many versions of the Ramayana, but the main one, of course, is the Valmiki Ramayana in Sanskrit. So that should be studied. It's an important part of Indian history and it's given Indian religion an enormous amount of material to work on. So you can study the Ramayana historically as this text. I mean, you could do a textual study of the Ramayana. People have done that. Um, and also some have shown that there's various versions of the Ramayana. There's Ramayana versions that are in Java. There's Ramayana versions in Bali. There's Ramayana versions all over the place. So one can make a literary historical study of the Ramayana. But should one use the Ramayana as a source material for a historical study of ancient Indian history? That is a much more difficult question because there's not too much in there that's documented history. It seems obvious to people that when the Ramayana speaks of Lanka, that what they mean is Sri Lanka, because the Sri Lanka is still there, and it's been called Lanka for quite some time. But there's actually no documented proof that Sri Lanka, the country that is there, off South India, is precisely what is meant by Lanka in the Ramayana. Now, I'm not an expert on Ramayana studies, but some people, in fact, doubt that the equivalence between Lanka and Sri Lanka. So that's something that uh, specialists in the Ramayana can look into, and it can be done in a historical way. What you were sort of asking, it seems to me, is um, can statements in the Ramayana that are written down in Sanskrit or in other languages in translation be taken as historical facts? There, I
Yeah.
think if you try to say answer yes to that, you're creating a confusion.
So we cannot. Can it be treated as academic reading? My question is that is these kind of what the history you're talking about or the itihas you're talking about should itihas be included in the academic can it be included or should it be included
Could you repeat that?
in
You were there
academic
was
history?
a jerk in the transmission.
So my question was, can or should itihas be included in academic historiography? Can it be included?
I think it's a different category altogether.
Yes. Okay. So
An
so
important
so
category,
yeah. Yeah.
but one that should not be studied as historia, as history,
Mhm.
what you call history in the Western sense. Of course, it's history in the Western sense has been practiced in India for two or 300 years, and people have contributed to history. And so that's something that can be studied, and uh, traditions about the life of Rama and so forth are part of the history of India. So that can be studied. But if it says so and so in line so and so of book so and so of the Ramayana, should that be taken as a literal historical fact? That would cause great confusion in the study of history because history, historia, as I was calling it, is based on the inquiry using documents of various sorts, literary documents, archaeological documents. And that's the job for historians. A historian might very well be extremely interested in the Ramayana as a text. He might even look through it for hints about history in an ancient time. But to just take, if what you're suggesting is, should the Ramayana be taken as a history book? No, it shouldn't. It's Itihas Quran.
Yes. You made a very interesting point, by the way, and which makes me ask you and proceed with the conversation, that are Western frameworks sufficient to interpret Indian spiritual figures?
No. Well, so it depends what you mean by sufficient. It's a possible way that you can approach a spiritual figure or any figure. There's a methodology about doing historical research, and that can extend into biographical research. So I've done a good amount of biographical research on various people, and I'm aware of the way that documents can be collected, read, analyzed, all that sort of thing. So that is what biographical historians do, and I've done it myself. That doesn't mean it's the only way that you can do anything like that. To study, for instance, a spiritual figure. No, there's many other possible approaches.
Okay, what do Western scholars often misunderstand about Indian philosophy?
So what do Indian scholars misunderstand about philosophy? Excuse me.
Yeah, you're not audible, Peter. You are not audible.
Okay, one
Yeah,
thing, let me
now
get
you
some
are.
water I didn't bring, and then, sorry. Uh, So philosophy is supposed to be
Yeah.
the study of, if not universal, at least non-contingent truths. They're truths that might exist um, regardless of the culture. So, what do Western scholars miss? What do Indian scholars miss?
Western
It,
scholars misunderstand about Indian philosophy.
well, that's what I'm saying. That
Yeah.
I think, for instance, if Western scholars are reading Indian texts without knowing the languages, then they're going to make certain clumsy mistakes. So one has to assume that if you're going to study um, Navya Nyaya or something like that, that you'll know Sanskrit very, very well, or Advaita, or any Buddhist school. You have to know the languages. Um, if what you're saying is that an Indian, in studying Indian philosophy, has a sort of necessary advantage over non-Indians, uh, I'm a little dubious about that, except insofar as they might have um, better knowledge of the language and a better knowledge of the general cultural framework in which Indian philosophy was written, was transmitted. So, a Western scholar could very well come to India, meet Indian philosophers, go to places where Indian philosophy is done, I don't think the cultural identity, the political identity even, necessarily makes any difference. And it's also quite possible for an Indian scholar to have certain deficiencies, maybe an inability to look critically at something that is held sacred in his community or something like that. So, would an Indian scholar who's studying uh, the life of Chaitanya, coming from a Vaishnava background, would that scholar be able to look critically at that text, or would he have to take it as um, uh, an something an unquestionable truth from beginning to end? That might that would be not a very good as a religious approach. So if you're a Vaishnava scholar and you want to approach um, uh, uh, the love of Krishna through texts of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, that's very fine. But will you really have the distance to be able to look critically at that, see where it fits in historically, how it compares to other forms of Vaishnavism or other philosophical frameworks in India? That would be a problem. I'm sure that it can be overcome, but I don't think cultural identity either uh, excludes inquiry from person of one culture or another, nor does it uh, somehow automatically give an advantage to people from one country or another.
So, yeah, that's very true, and I completely agree. But what I was trying to make my point is um, a person who has lived experience,
A
a
person who
person
has
who has lived experience about that culture and he is born and brought up in that culture has definitely an upper edge because he has not only lived, he has been practicing since childhood, since his birth. So that kind of upper edge he has, maybe for that reason. Yeah.
certainly it's advantageous from uh, in the from the point of view that you suggest, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that person will always have an advantage that can be applied to not a religious but a philosophical statement. It depends. What is the study for? Are you just interested in speaking about a particular text or particular form of the divine that is important to you and to members of the community, or are you trying to express it to people who might not find that particular uh, uh, school of philosophy interesting and might not want to participate in it in that way? What the question is, will there be any communication? Surely a person who is absorbed in Gaudiya Vaishnavism is definitely going to um, have a lived experience that will give him insights or give her insights into what that is all about. But will that will such a lived experience be necessary to come to a full or a partial understanding of that school of thought? I'm a little dubious about that. It's an advantage,
Yeah.
but is it
I,
an advantage that cannot be overcome? I'll just give what's entering my mind. I'm having a dialogue now with a Swami of the Ramakrishna mission who happens to know a lot about Sri Aurobindo. And we've
Right.
had a lot of back and forth, and are
Right.
the results of our dialogue are going to be published. So I found that he and it's not so much about Ramakrishna as about Sri Aurobindo, that he, as a scholar of the works of Ramakrishna and Vivekananda, um, also has a strong interest in Sri Aurobindo and a good knowledge of Sri Aurobindo. So should I say that no, he doesn't have the right to speak about Sri Aurobindo because he belongs to a different tradition? Obviously not. But would I say that he's possibly likely to make certain mistakes that I need to point out? Yes, I've done that. So it's a question of communication. It's not a question of speaking in absolutes.
Yeah, that's very true and rightly pointed out. Let's move on to the next section of our conversation, which is the actually completely focused on Sri Aurobindo, and we'll quickly have some of the questions. Um, do you feel that Aurobindo is mystic or revolutionary? What's your
Mystic or
point of view?
I
Aurobindo, is he revolutionary or mystic,
both.
according to you?
He was both.
Both. Yes.
He was a
So
revolutionary when
because
he
of the
was a
life.
revolutionary, and
Yeah. Yes.
and
Right.
and uh, when I gave the title "The Lives of Sri Aurobindo," uh, obviously it was the same man all the time, but he was during a certain period of his life a revolutionary, and from a certain point he became, let's call it, a mystic. Um, and he had other personalities as well. So it's not a question of one or the other. I see it
Yeah.
as a plurality.
Okay. So one misconception about Aurobindo you want to debunk.
One
One
misconception. Well,
misconception about Aurobindo you want to debunk.
yeah, you might recall in the conference that we both attended that we tried to question the idea that Sherman was, as many people say, a Hindu nationalist. And he's been called that both by people who think it's a wonderful thing, and because it shows that he was a representative of the great tradition of India, and by people who think it's a terrible thing because he opened the door to communalism. Um, in fact, if you look carefully at Sri Aurobindo's writings, you'll see that the kind of cherry picking approach to documents is behind this limited idea of how one should approach him. Uh, he, he certainly he was a revolutionary. He was a nationalist. He wasn't actually a conventional Hindu, and for the first part of his life, he knew nothing about Hinduism. In the later part of his life, he didn't identify as a Hindu, but for a certain period, he looked upon himself as a Hindu, and he uh, cited Hindu texts in political speeches. So does that make him a Hindu politician, a Hindu nationalist? The one funny thing that I found out recently, as part of a work in finding out the uh, intertextuality of Sri Aurobindo's writings, is that in fact during his political use he cited the Christian Bible actually more often than he cited um, books like the Bhagavad Gita. Now that doesn't mean he was a Christian, and certainly not a Christian nationalist. Um, I think people have not bothered to read carefully the texts that are supposed to show Sri Aurobindo's Hindu nationality, and that's even sometimes when the idea of true Hindu nationality came along, this was with the Hindu Sabha of Punjab, which was organized in November 1909. As soon as it was organized, Sri Aurobindo said this is not a possibility that
Peter, your
India
voice is
exists.
lost somewhere.
Okay,
Your voice is lost somewhere. Yeah.
can you hear me now?
Uh, yeah, I can hear you, but it's actually not audible. It's breaking sometimes.
Okay, well that maybe is the
Yeah, this is good. This is good. Fine. Yeah.
okay. It's
Yeah. Perfect.
maybe a technical thing. My connection is okay.
Thank you. Yeah. Connection.
So
My
so Sri
connection.
Aurobindo.
Yeah. Hmm.
So if Sri Aurobindo, as soon as Hindu nationalism is put forward on the public stage by the Punjab Hindu Sabha, and Sri Aurobindo says this is an impossibility, that India cannot um, be taken as a Muslim India or a Hindu India, that it must exist as a whole, and the whole idea of the Hindu Sabha was an error. Then how can you call him a Hindu nationalist? And yet people do. So that's a misconception that I tried to bring out in that paper, or rather that talk, and I've developed it more in the paper that we're supposed to be submitting. So that, and I think again it goes back to cherry picking. That there's 3 or 4 texts that people use and reuse, and someone will read it and use it in their own writings and so forth. And no one really has gone to the trouble of making a thorough study of what Sri Aurobindo said about those subjects. And that's unfortunate. So that's a misconception that as I did in that conference, I'd like to sort of open up to further discussion.
Okay. So that brings up with one more question, which is what, as an archivist, what is the lesser known aspect of Aurobindo you discovered?
With this discovery that I made almost accidentally recently about the number of quotations and allusions to Christian texts, the Bible mostly, that he made throughout his life, from the time he was in England straight through to the poem Savitri. Because I didn't know much about Christianity, I had a vague awareness that quite a number of passages in his works alluded to the Bible. But it wasn't until I asked friends to help me collect things, and then also I ran an AI search throughout the entirety of Sri Aurobindo's works, comparing it to what I mean. You can tell AI that you take this text, which is the Christian Bible, and you take this, which is the complete works of Sri Aurobindo, and find allusions and quotations. And there's an enormous number. I had no idea. Now, again, that's just data, right? You don't, well, one doesn't want to rush into making any conclusions. Obviously, Sri Aurobindo was not a Christian. He said quite clearly that he never was made to accept Christianity when he was in England. And while he was in England, he founded the Christian culture that he was exposed to was not to his liking at all. So certainly he wasn't a Christian, but that throughout his life, he again and again referred to the Bible, quoted from the Bible. If you're not familiar with the Bible, and I wasn't myself terribly familiar with the Bible, you won't even notice these things. An allusion, as opposed to a quotation, you don't say where it came from. But even in when he speaks about Hindu subjects, he's constantly referring to the Bible. So that was a surprise. Now, it would be foolish to immediately say, well, this means that, and that means this, and that's because of this, and so forth. But as far as just collecting data, that was a surprising result of this particular inquiry.
Okay. So, one must-read book on Indian intellectual history. What's your suggestion? One read book.
Well, the trouble with the historiography, when you say historiography, do you mean a book presenting a historical period?
Can you repeat it again, Peter? We could not get you. Can you repeat it again? Yeah.
Precisely what you mean by historiography.
Yeah.
Technically,
No.
historiography is the methodology of doing history. Is that what you mean?
No, my question was something else. I was asking that one must read book you'd suggest on Indian intellectual history. One must read book.
Indian intellectual history. Well, okay.
Yeah.
You asked me that earlier, and I had to think. The trouble with Indian, the discipline of history in India is it tends to be rather
This,
ideologically
okay.
framed.
Uh,
And I didn't want to suggest a book that is representing this or that ideological position. But one book that came to mind that's interesting both from the point of view of methodology and also from the point of view of a narrative presentation is a book by Patrick Oliver on Ashoka. It was published a couple of years ago.
Patrick Oliver by Ashoka.
The,
Could you repeat it? We could not get you. Yeah. We could not hear
so,
you properly. Yeah.
yeah. So the book is Ashoka by Patrick
Ashoka.
Oliver. Right.
Okay.
And
Ashoka
he's
by
a Sri
Patrick
Lankan
Oliver.
scholar. He's a Sri Lankan scholar based in America, and he knows Sanskrit very, very well. He's written a lot of translations of Sanskrit texts. He knows Pali very, very well. And he's gone through all the Ashoka inscriptions. Now, we don't know too much about Ashoka per se outside of the inscriptions. But in going through the entire corpus of Ashoka inscriptions and then linking it with other forms of other types of historical knowledge about that period, he put together a very, very living picture of Ashoka and his era that is quite amazing when you think of how little we in fact know about the man. So that both as a methodological example and as an example of very good writing, it's a book I can recommend.
Oh, that's great. So, one final question to you before we close down this conversation is what advice you would give to young scholars who are balancing the faith and the critical thinking? What advice would you give?
Follow your faith, think critically. Don't let your faith overwhelm your critical thinking, and don't let your critical thinking overwhelm or smother your faith. The two can work together. So you don't have to see them as being opponents. You can see them as allies that will help you go forward in and make a fuller make your approach to whatever subject you're doing fuller and richer.
That was great talking to you, and it's an honor that you made time for us to talk. And thank you for joining us for this insightful conversation with you. I'm really
Thank you
glad
for
that you
having
joined,
me.
and I hope that this discussion has opened up new ways of thinking about history, culture, Aurobindo, and his ideas. And please do share your thoughts in the comments. And do not forget to like, subscribe, and share for more such conversations. Thank you, all of you. And thank you, Peter, for joining again.
Thanks for having me.